Was standing in the hallway outside the guest bedroom, holding a gift bag I'd spent 40 minutes wrapping, when my driver grabbed my arm and pulled me sideways into the linen closet. He didn't explain. He just put one finger to his lips and pulled the door almost shut, leaving maybe an inch of light between us and the hallway. I was so startled I didn't even breathe. His name is Wendell. He's worked for me for 11 years. He drove my late husband to chemotherapy every Tuesday for 8 months without ever being asked twice. He is not a man who does dramatic things. So I stood in the dark between stacks of folded towels and I listened. My son's wedding was in 4 hours. I should back up a little. My name is Loretta. I'm 67 years old. I live in a house I've lived in for 32 years in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. My husband, Robert, passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. It was fast. 6 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every one of those months learning how to become someone who could function alone. I have 2 children. My son, whose wedding was that afternoon, is 34. His name is Mitchell. He's an engineer, calm and methodical, the kind of man who keeps a spreadsheet for his grocery list. I've always admired that about him. His fiancée, a woman named Petra, was 29. She'd been in his life for 3 years. I had tried, genuinely tried, to love her. She had a way of looking at me that I can only describe as calculating. Like she was always figuring something out. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was one of those mothers. I had worked very hard not to be one of those mothers. My daughter lives in Portland. She had flown in the night before and was already at the venue helping with flowers. She and I have always been close in the way that mothers and daughters sometimes are when they've both been through something hard together. She lost her father the same year I lost my husband, and grief has a way of soldering people. The rehearsal dinner the previous evening had gone fine. Petra was charming. Mitchell was happy. I smiled until my face hurt, and I meant most of it. Then I went to bed, and I could not sleep. I'm not sure why. Some feeling I couldn't name. The kind that sits in your chest at 2 in the morning and won't tell you what it wants. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 6. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the house where both my children had grown up. And I thought about Robert, the way I always do on big days. He would have loved this. He would have worn his good suit and cried during the vows and pretended he wasn't crying, and Mitchell would have teased him about it for years. I got dressed. I had a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and pearl stud earrings that had been my mother's. I'd done my hair the day before. I felt, for the first time in a while, like myself. Wendell arrived at 9 to drive me to the venue. The ceremony wasn't until 2, but there were family photos at 11, and I promised Mitchell I'd be there early. The venue was a restored farmhouse about 40 minutes outside the city. One of those places with white painted wood and string lights, and a barn that smelled like cedar. Robert would have called it aggressively charming. He meant that as a compliment. We arrived around 10:15. The parking area was mostly empty. Some vendor vehicles, a florist van, my daughter's rental car. Wendell parked and offered to carry my bag inside. I told him to take his time. I'd walk ahead. The farmhouse had a wide porch and a hallway that ran straight through the middle, with rooms branching off on either side. I knew the bridal suite was in the back left. The groom's room was upstairs. I was almost to the end of the hallway when I heard voices behind a door on my right. A room I assumed was being used for storage, or maybe as a second dressing room. I recognized Petra's voice first, and then I heard Mitchell's name, and then I stopped walking. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. I was not eavesdropping. I had no intention of stopping. I did not press my ear to the door. I simply froze, the way you do when something doesn't make sense, when your brain needs a second to catch up with what your ears have just delivered. What I heard was this. Petra sang, in a low voice that had none of the warmth she performed at dinner tables. It doesn't matter what she suspects. By the time she figures anything out, the accounts will already be restructured. A man's voice I didn't recognize said, He's going to want to know where the money came from. Petra said, Mitchell doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answered. That's the whole point of Mitchell. I stood very still. That was when Wendell appeared at the far end of the hallway. He must have come in through a side entrance. He looked at me, and then he looked at the door, and I watched something move across his face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Recognition. He walked toward me quietly and took my arm and guided me back down the hallway into the linen closet, and that was when he put his finger to his lips. We stood in that closet for perhaps 4 minutes. I counted my own heartbeats because I needed something to count. When the voices faded and the door opened and closed elsewhere in the building, Wendell eased the closet door open and looked both ways down the hallway like we were children sneaking out past curfew, and then he nodded at me and we walked out to the porch. The morning air was cool. There were birds somewhere in the tree line. I sat down on the porch steps because my knees had made a private decision to stop cooperating. Wendell sat down next to me, which he has never done before. In 11 years, he has always been professionally correct about the distance between us. That he sat down told me more than anything he'd said. "How long have you known something was wrong?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Since February." It was now September. "Wendell." "I didn't know what I knew," he said. "I drove her to a meeting in February. A financial office downtown, not the one she usually uses. She told me to wait outside, and I did. But I wrote down the name on the building." He paused. "I looked it up later. It's a firm that specializes in asset restructuring for international transfers." I stared at him. "I didn't want to tell you something that might be nothing," he said. "I thought maybe there was an explanation. A legitimate one. And the man in there with her just now. I don't know his name, but I've seen him before. He was at the coffee shop on Broadview 2 months ago when she and I were waiting for Mitchell to finish a meeting. She said he was an old colleague." Wendell paused again. "She introduced him to me by a different name than the one on the building directory." I stood my hands in my lap. My mother's earrings. My navy dress. "She said Mitchell doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answered," I said. Wendell didn't respond to that. He didn't have to. Here is what I knew about money. In that moment, sitting on those porch steps. Robert had left me well provided for. The house, some investments, and a trust that had been carefully structured by our attorney over the last years of his life. The trust was in my name. It was not a marital asset by Ohio law. My own attorney, a woman named Sandra who I've worked with for 9 years, had made very certain of that. But there was other money. Robert had also left Mitchell a substantial amount, not a controlling sum, but meaningful, with the provision that if Mitchell married, a portion would roll into a joint account with his spouse. That provision had felt generous when Robert wrote it. He wanted Mitchell's partner to feel included, to feel like family from the start. That was Robert. Always optimistic about people. Always building bridges. I had not thought about that provision in years. I was thinking about it now. I was thinking about a woman who visited an asset restructuring firm 6 months before her wedding. I was thinking about a man whose name changed depending on the room. I was thinking about the phrase "by the time she figures anything out." She had been talking about me. I asked Wendell to take me back to the city. He didn't question it. He just walked me to the car. I called my daughter on the way. She answered on the second ring, already somewhere in the middle of a sentence about centerpieces, and I said, "I need you to listen to me carefully and not react until I'm done talking." To her enormous credit, she didn't react until I was done talking. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted about 6 seconds. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I told her. Sandra has been my attorney for 9 years, and in that time I have seen her be surprised exactly once when her parking spot was taken by a catering van at a charity lunch. She is not a dramatic woman. She appreciates facts arranged in order. I gave her facts. I gave her Windows account of February, the name of the firm, the man with two names. I gave her the exact words I had heard to adore on a wedding morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The trust is protected. That part I can tell you right now, without looking at anything. The structure Robert set up is airtight. She cannot touch it." "What about Mitchell's portion?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's more complicated. Once they're married and the rollover occurs, it becomes a joint asset. Depending on how it's structured after that point, a transfer becomes legally possible. Not without his signature, but Mitchell doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answered." Another pause. "Loretta, is there any possibility he's involved in this?" I had been sitting with that question since the porch steps. I had turned it over and looked at every side of it, the way you do when you need to be sure you're being honest with yourself and not just comfortable. "No," I said. "Mitchell is not a sophisticated liar. He never has been. He can't even return a dish to a restaurant without apologizing to the waiter." "All right," Sandra said. "Then here's what I think we need to do." I did not go back to the wedding venue until 1:30. In the time between, Sandra made 3 phone calls. My daughter handled 2 things I'd asked her to handle, quietly and without drawing attention to herself, because she has always been better at composure under pressure than I have. And Wendell sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Sandra's office and wrote down everything he remembered in chronological order in the notes app on his phone, because Sandra asked him to, and he obliged without complaint. I changed out of my navy dress and put on a different one. Dark green, one I'd worn to Robert's memorial service and then worn twice since because it has pockets and I've always believed in practical grief. When I arrived back at the venue, the ceremony was 40 minutes away. The photographer was doing final checks. My daughter met me at the door with a look on her face that people who don't know her would read as calm, and that I read correctly as barely contained fury held in place by sheer discipline. "Everything is in place," she said quietly. "How's Mitchell?" "Nervous. Normal nervous." She paused. "He's happy, Mom. He actually loves her." That was the part that was hardest. Not the money. The money was a problem with a solution. Mitchell's happiness was a different kind of damage. "I know," I said. "The ceremony was beautiful, if I'm being honest. The farmhouse lit up in the late afternoon sun. Mitchell cried during the vows, exactly like his father would have. The officiant, a college friend of Mitchell's, told a story about a camping trip that made everyone laugh. Petra looked stunning. She knew how to occupy a room. I watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, and I tried to find something in her face that looked like love. And I thought I saw it, and then I remembered what I had heard that morning, and I couldn't be sure anymore what was performance and what was real. Maybe some of it was real. I don't know. People are capable of wanting 2 things at the same time, even when one of those things is terrible. I smiled. I held my daughter's hand. I did not cry, which was unusual for me, but I think I had used up whatever capacity I had for tears somewhere on those porch steps. The reception was at the same venue. Dinner, dancing, toasts. My daughter gave a speech that was funny and warm and made Mitchell laugh so hard he had to put down his fork. I sat at the head family table. Petra sat beside Mitchell across from me, and at some point during the salad course, she leaned across and touched my hand and said, "We're so glad you're here. Mitchell talks about you constantly." I looked at her. I smiled. I said I wouldn't have missed it. She held my gaze for a moment, looking for something, and I gave her nothing to find. I left at 9:30. I'd said my goodbyes, hugged Mitchell for a long time, told him I was proud of him and that his father would have been too. That part I meant without reservation. Whatever came next, I meant that. Wendell drove me home. We didn't talk much. The highway was quiet. At some point, he said, "You did well today." I said, "I didn't do anything yet." "You showed up," he said. "That was the hard part." I looked out the window at the dark fields going past. "How did you know?" "This morning, in the hallway. You knew before I'd even stopped walking." He thought about it for a moment. The way she said his name, he said. When I'd driven her places, she always said his name like it was a punchline, like she was in on a joke he didn't know about. He paused. I noticed it a long time ago. I just didn't know what to do with it. You should have told me. Yes, he said simply. I should have. We left it at that. 3 weeks after the wedding, Sandra and I met with a forensic financial consultant she had used before, a methodical woman named Gail who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke about money the way doctors speak about test results, clearly without drama, as though the emotional weight of a thing is separate from its facts. What Gail found over the following 6 weeks was a plan, not a complete one, not one that had yet been executed, but the architecture of one, a sequence of intended transfers, beginning with Mitchell's inheritance rollover and moving outward from there, through the firm in February, through accounts registered to a holding company that shared a partial address with the man Wendell had seen twice. Gail's conclusion, delivered in a conference room with coffee going cold on the table, was that the plan had been designed to move money offshore in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic review. It would have worked, she said, if it had gotten far enough to begin. It hadn't. Sandra had placed what she described as precautionary instruments on Mitchell's inherited funds the week of the wedding, pending a formal review. It wasn't a freeze. It wasn't accusatory. It was, she explained to Mitchell when she called him, a routine protective measure she recommended for all inherited assets following a major life change. Mitchell had said, "Okay, that sounds sensible. Should I be worried?" Sandra had said, "Not at this time," which was careful and true. I had not told Mitchell anything yet. That decision kept me up at night, more than the money had. A mother's job is not to protect her children from difficult things. I know that. My own mother protected me from too much and left me unprepared for ordinary grief. I had tried to do it differently with my children. But I also knew that what I had was inference and preparation and a forensic accountant's reconstruction of an intent. I did not have a confession. I did not have yet proof of something Mitchell could point to and say, "That is what she did." I waited. It came in November. Not from Petra. Not from the man with two names, who turned out to be a low-level financial arranger with a history of involvement in similar schemes in 2 other states, a fact Sandra's investigator uncovered with the patience of someone who enjoys finding things. It came from Petra's sister. I had met her once, at the engagement party. A quieter woman, younger by 4 years, who had seemed vaguely uncomfortable the entire evening and left early. Her name was not one I would have remembered except that my daughter had mentioned her once in passing. She seemed like she wanted to say something and didn't know how. She called me on a Tuesday morning in November. She said she had been trying to decide for months whether to make this call. She said she was not going to tell me anything she couldn't verify, but that she wanted me to know that what her sister had discussed with her before the wedding was not something she had agreed to or approved of or stayed silent about by choice. She had tried to talk Petra out of it. Petra had told her, "It's not stealing, it's correcting an imbalance. That family has more than they need." I sat with the phone against my ear and looked out my kitchen window at the bare November yard. "Thank you for calling," I said. "I don't know if it helps," she said. "It helps," I said. I told Mitchell in December. I asked him to come to the house on a Sunday, and I made coffee and put out the things he likes, the good cheese, the crackers his father used to buy, and I sat him down at the kitchen table and I told him all of it. Wendell's account, Sandra's precautionary instruments, Gail's findings, the call from his sister-in-law. I had prepared myself for him to push back, to defend her, to tell me I had misunderstood or that I was the kind of mother who couldn't let her son be happy. I had been ready for that conversation. I had run it in my head many times. What actually happened was that Mitchell sat very still while I talked, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, I think I knew something wasn't right. I just kept deciding not to look at it. That was the hardest sentence I've ever had to sit with. Not because he was wrong, because he was right and he knew it, and the knowing of it was going to cost him more than the money ever would have. We sat at that table for a long time. I didn't tell him what to do. I'm his mother, not his judge. What he decided about his marriage was his to decide. I just made sure he decided it with all the information in front of him. He filed for an annulment in January. Ohio law permits annulment under specific circumstances, and fraud, which is what Sandra ultimately called it in formal terms, informal documents, is among them. It was not a fast process. It was not a clean one. There were lawyers, and there were arguments, and there were moments, I'm told, where Petra maintained that everything had been a misunderstanding, that the accounts were for legitimate investment purposes, that Gail had drawn the wrong conclusions from incomplete data. The man with two names, when interviewed by an investigator, provided a rather different account. The annulment was finalized in late spring. Mitchell took some time off work. He stayed with me for 2 weeks in February, which I had not expected and which meant more to me than I have adequate words for. He slept in his old room. He ate the things I cooked. He watched old movies with me on weeknights, the ones his father used to like, and he didn't say much about any of it. He was grieving. You don't have to lose someone to death to grieve them. He knew that now. My daughter flew in for a weekend in March. The three of us went to the cemetery on Saturday morning and stood at Robert's grave for a while, not saying much. On the way back, Mitchell said Dad would have seen through her in about 10 minutes. My daughter said Dad would have been polite about it for way longer than that. Mitchell almost smiled. Yeah, he would have. We stopped for breakfast on the way home. We sat in the booth at a diner we'd been going to since the kids were small, and we ate eggs and talked about nothing much. And for about 40 minutes it felt like an ordinary morning. Wendell still drives me. He drives me to Sandra's office and to the grocery store and to my sister's house in Dublin on holidays. Last spring I updated my estate documents, which is something I should have done sooner. Sandra walked me through each section with her customary efficiency. When we got to the part about bequests outside the immediate family, I told her I wanted to include Wendell. She looked up from the document. He's on the list. I said, I know. I want to increase it. She nodded and made a note and moved on. That was all. I told Wendell afterward in the car on the way home. I didn't make a speech about it. I just told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's not necessary. I said, I know, I did it anyway. He nodded. He drove. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, the way it does in Ohio in late spring, and I watched the familiar streets go past and thought about Robert and what it means to trust someone. Not because they're perfect, not because they never hesitated, but because when it counted, they showed up in the hallway. And that, I think, is the whole story. I still think about that linen closet sometimes. The way the light came through the inch-wide gap in the door. The way Wendell stood so still beside me, like he'd been carrying the weight of what he knew for so long that holding it one more minute was nothing. What happened to me, to my family, didn't come out of nowhere. Looking back, the signs were there. A woman who visited a financial restructuring firm 6 months before her own wedding. A man who introduced himself by 2 different names depending on who was in the room. A son who, by his own admission, kept deciding not to look too closely at things that didn't add up. None of it appeared overnight. It built quietly, the way most things do when people are counting on no one paying attention. That's the part I've thought about the most. Not the betrayal itself, but the patience it required. Petra wasn't reckless, she was deliberate. And the thing that stopped her wasn't luck. It was Wendell writing down the name of a building in February, and then holding on to that information because he didn't know yet what it meant, and then recognizing the moment on a wedding morning in a farmhouse hallway when it meant everything. He did the right thing because he had been paying attention for years. That kind of integrity, the quiet, unglamorous kind, The kind that doesn't announce itself is what I think of now when I hear the word character. It's not a dramatic gesture. It's showing up and noticing and doing the next correct thing, even when you're not sure anyone will ever know you did it. Mitchell is the one I worry about even now. Not because he did anything wrong, but because he told me something true at that kitchen table that I don't think he'll forget soon. That he'd known something wasn't right. That he'd chosen not to look. I don't say this to judge him. I've made the same choice in smaller ways, in quieter moments, and I think most honest people have. But the cost of that particular choice, in his case, was a year of his life and a grief that's still working its way through him. The willingness to look clearly at what's in front of you, even when looking is uncomfortable, is something that has to be practiced. It doesn't come naturally. It didn't come naturally to me either at 67. I had to sit on cold porch steps in a dress I'd bought for a celebration to finally see what had been arranged around me. And then I had to decide what to do with that. Not from anger. Anger would have made me sloppy. From clarity. From the kind of steadiness that Robert modeled for 30-some years. The kind that says, here is the situation. Here are the facts. Here is the next right step. I called my daughter. I called Sandra. I let people who knew what they were doing do what they were good at. That, I think, is its own kind of strength. Knowing when to act and when to trust someone else with the part they're better equipped to handle. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that the people who stay are rarely the loudest ones in the room. Wendell never made a speech. He never asked for recognition. He drove me home and said you showed up and left it at that. That's the whole of it, really. You pay attention. You tell the truth when it matters. You show up. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, the people around you do the same.